So I'm going to present you some of the things that we've looked at in terms of grasslands, hopefully. Yes, it's changing. Okay, so grasslands really important as a habitat in the UK because it has a significant coverage of UK land area. 40% is the highest of any of the habitats, and it includes a whole range of different grassland types. So we've got everything from moorland and acid grasslands in the uplands, although not exclusively, also do get the acid grasslands in the lowlands. And this picture with the belted galloways wandering across a sort of acid moorland grass demonstrates those kind of habitats. And then there's neutral and improved grasslands, which is what we'd be more used to looking at in the sort of green hedged picture there, and calcareous grassland. So only 2% of our grassland is actually species rich and what we'd call semi-natural. And there's a picture there of a species rich piece of grassland, and our priority habitat grasslands are listed under there. So they're hay meadows and lowland meadows and lowland and upland calcareous. There was underneath that nice pretty picture. Okay, my slides are moving on of their own account. I knew they would. Okay, so grassland in terms of their function, so they are primarily managed for agricultural production, even those ones in the uplands that we saw are managed for agricultural production, and only a relatively small percentage are managed for conservation benefit, and those of the semi-natural grasslands that we talked a very low proportion, and they often will have livestock on grazing as part of their management. So in terms of area, I've got these figures from the Countryside Survey. Many of you will know I've been involved with that, but it is the last kind of audit in detail of grassland areas for the different types. And it shows us that improved grassland is indeed our most common grassland at over 20%, and the others much less, with calcareous grassland right down there at the bottom. In terms of species numbers, so in terms of their current biodiversity value, what the Picasso looks like at the moment, improved grassland is around 14 species in the standard plots that we use in CS, whereas calcareous grassland is 43 species. So quite a significant difference between those two, and somewhere in between the neutral and the acid grasslands. So looking at them in terms of their soil carbon, also from Countryside Survey, they differ greatly, and haven't got a figure for calcareous grasslands because we don't sample that many of them because they're not that common in Countryside Survey. So the figures for the other grasslands show that improved grassland has sort of 51.7 kilograms per kilogram of carbon, whereas acid grassland often sort of on upland or peaty soils has a much higher proportion of soil carbon. So they're also already very important in terms of what they're providing us in terms of biodiversity and soil carbon storage. They're also really important for well-being. Grasslands are important for access, easy to walk on, beauty and wildlife, and they're very significant in lots of our national parks, in our areas of outstanding natural beauty. So in the North Pennines, the upland hay meadows, our species-rich grasslands, that's a very important area for those. And also UNESCO World Heritage Sites like the Lake District. On a personal note, this is the grassland I walk over every day if I possibly can. And during COVID, it was incredibly important for my well-being. So I think we would all recognise that grasslands are important for that. I did insert the little curlew in the corner there just to say that they are also very important for wildlife, and curlew being a species that particularly relies on grasslands. So in terms of climate change mitigation, we know that from the land cover change map, which you may have seen Claire Rowland present, that there has been a significant loss of grassland between 1990 and 2015. You'll see the figures there, and note also that there has been a loss of arable, because that's important in the context of what I'm going to talk about. But we don't really know whether that grassland is permanent grassland or lays, but that loss loss of grassland leads to significant greenhouse gas emissions through the oxidization and mineralization of that soil carbon that we've seen is so important in grasslands. So therefore retaining permanent grassland in situ is a really important mitigation option. And it is something that there has been sort of government legislation and guidance around. So you're not supposed to, there are certain, if you've got a permanent grassland, there are rules about whether or not you can plough it up, depending on how long that permanent is. I think 15 years is often said to be the permanent threshold, but yeah, there still has been that massive loss over that time period. So that's important to look at. So reducing ploughing and sowing of temporary grassland established is also a mitigation technique. So at the moment, sort of guidelines, if you go up to the Agricultural and Horticultural Development AHDB board, they recommend that you plough and sow your grasslands between 5 and 10 years to maintain a good sward. But maybe you know, we need to be looking at alternative methods of managing. So one method might be to do that less often. Another one is to convert arable land to grassland, and you'll see that there was a loss of arable land, and we do know that from Countryside Survey that in the past that has gone to grassland. So that's one option. Others include having more lays in arable land, or changing the species composition of those lays. So on the right, there's a grass clover lay and a species rich lay, and the difference is the rooting depth really of those species. Lowly and Peren, the most common grassland species, has a relatively shallow rooting depth. So there are options around the way you manage your lays that could assist with climate change. So again, we said about, in terms of biodiversity, retaining the current extent, same for carbon, but retaining the current extent of semi-natural grasslands is really important. There's only 2%. We can't really afford to lose any more of those by planting trees on them, as has already been said, or increasing heathland extent on them. So that's one important way of mitigating against change to biodiversity. Another way is to improve the biodiversity potential of semi-improved grasslands. So semi-natural are those much more species-rich ones. Semi-improved tend to be the ones that have been managed quite intensively, possibly at some time, like that bottom picture, which is a really intensively managed lowlium sward. But it may be possible to increase those in terms of their biodiversity and their carbon storage potential. And some farmers doing these things, they're incorporating much more species-rich mixtures, over-sowing rather than ploughing, and ploughing and sowing. There's also ways to manage grazing, another slide on that in a second, and minimising impacts or impact inputs can also significantly increase, which can also significantly increase greenhouse gas emissions, could really help. Inputs also result in reduced biodiversity because you tend to get domination by a nutrient-loving species. So there are potentially ways of managing our grasslands swards differently, but I've put the note that it's important to consider productivity in semi-improved grasslands, because obviously these are farmed habitats, but maybe we could do that farming differently. So in terms of grazing management, there are tried and tested techniques. Apologies for not including lots of literature in these slides. It will be in the chapter. But you can mix up your grazing. You can have different species, and that's known to benefit both biodiversity and soil carbon. You can reduce your numbers. You can graze in a rotation. So rotational grazing systems are very much coming back into fashion with farmers at the moment. And one particular system, mob grazing, is really coming into fashion. And this is a picture of a farmer that was mob grazing where I was sampling his site last year, and quite dense herd of cattle grazing there. And we don't really necessarily know what that means for carbon and biodiversity yet, and I think the work is still to be done in detail to understand that, but there are sort of claims about it increasing carbon in the soil, and potentially benefiting biodiversity, because you've got much longer swards for a lot of the year rather than having them constantly grazed down. So there are things to be looking at. So I've incorporated a sort of a picture from Cotswold Seeds there of plants for soil fertility. So there's a real appetite also for sort of new seed mixes, and farmers are interested in seeing not just how palatable those are, but also what do their roots look like, and do they mean you've got more carbon storage in the soil, which is better for long-term productivity of the soil, and also obviously better for biodiversity because you've got a much richer sward there. So I think there's a lot of movement in grazing management at the moment, so that's interesting. Other mitigation and adaptation options around grassland include floodplains for water storage. Obviously, we're getting more rain, more wet to put somewhere, more water to put somewhere, and floodplains and grasslands are a very good place for that. So that's a nature-based solution for them. There's also the potential to restore habitats that have been degraded to grassland. So it may be that grassland goes in the other direction, goes back to bog and upland heath, which is better for storing carbon in the long run. And that probably is around reduced grazing pressure, but also active restoration. And then the tree planting on low carbon grassland soils. David and I are agreeing on what parts of the landscape could perhaps be have more trees on them. But I'd perhaps argue that there are people looking at, and there may be potential for having trees and animals together, so that the grassland doesn't have to disappear and its grazing management doesn't have to disappear. So yes, that's me finished really. So I just want to say that there are obviously nature-based solutions around grassland that can really have an impact on future biodiversity and carbon, and yeah, we'd like to see some of them being introduced.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's great to see the synergies starting to come together between those chapters from the chapter authors.